We'll just give everybody a moment to get wired, and then we'll get underway. Good evening and welcome to the forum at the John F. Kennedy School of Government. My name is Ira Jackson. I'm Director of the Center for Business and Government and your host for this evening's timely debate and discussion on California's blackouts. Could it happen here? For the past 8 years, the Harvard Electricity Policy Group, led by Professor Bill Hogan here at CBG, has been exploring ways to restructure electricity markets in a way that expands competition, enhances consumer choice and benefits, and improves environmental conservation through a process that engenders public trust and confidence. Bill and his colleagues have done pioneering work at the cutting edge of a global trend. So what went wrong between the theory and the practice? Why did so many of the basic precepts and preconditions that Bill and his colleagues from business, government, and the not-for-profit sector world knew were so successful, why were they so ignored? How much has the logic for deregulation and marketization of electricity been set back or derailed as a result? How much damage has already been done to short-circuit the California economy? Why did it take so long for regulators and others to realize that deregulation in the Golden State is not just an economic issue, but a political crisis? And what about the rest of the country? Could it happen here or in New York City next? Well, to illumine these and other questions and to moderate the panel, we have someone who knows the issue inside and out and from almost every perspective in between. Phil Sharp was a 10-term member of Congress from Indiana. He served as chair of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee and was one of the architects of the 1992 Energy Policy Act. He's a former director of the Institute of Politics here at the Kennedy School, a consultant to industry who sits on several private sector boards, and he teaches the politics of policymaking, injecting competition into the electric utility industry. In short, Phil has done it all. Tonight, Phil serves as our designated hitter in leading what promises to be an informative, perhaps an electrifying discussion. Please join me in welcoming Phil Sharp.
Well, thank you very much. Ira was kind enough not to mention I lost my first 2 elections. And so while he was suggesting I might know something about electricity, there are critics who suggest I still haven't learned how to win the election yet when it comes to this subject. But I just wanted to start out with a few comments about where we are in this debate and then turn it over to some very distinguished and knowledgeable and engaged people that we have on the panel this afternoon. For more than 100 years, as I'm sure you're aware, we have essentially provided electricity to the American economy and the American consumer through private monopolies that were regulated by government or by government agencies or by cooperatives, not by the usual style of the way we do business in America. And suddenly, about 10 years ago, we began to take seriously the idea that maybe there is a better way to do this. Other industries that had been extensively economically regulated during the New Deal had begun to undo those regulations and to depend more heavily on market forces to set prices, manage investments, and consumer behavior. And so the assumption was maybe there was a lot to gain, as many of us believe there is and was, in the electric utility sector the same way. And so at the moment, we are engaged in a transition, moving from, we think, a regulated monopoly system into at least major elements of this industry that will be deregulated, or that is, that they will be a part of a competitive market, while wires will remain regulated by state and federal government. The reason for doing this essentially have to do with the notion that in our modern, fast-paced economy, when we look at monopolies and we look at regulated monopolies, they tend to not have the incentives to adjust rapidly. They don't have the incentives to be as efficient in their economic operation and therefore hopefully cut costs. They tend to be slower about adopting innovative technology, innovative management techniques, new products and services that we find elsewhere in the competitive industry. And also, they don't tend to be as attentive to what consumers want, especially as they begin to change their minds or what their needs are in the society. So that was the fundamental argument going forward as this was intellectually debated. But the real political driver throughout the country, in California and elsewhere, was simply the simple assumption that if we will begin to bring competition in, we will cut prices. And everybody gains because prices go down. Indeed, one of the fundamental assumptions made, as an outsider, and our folks from California may dispute this, that seemed to be made by the decision makers in California as they progressed toward what we call retail competition. They simply assumed the wholesale market would be stable, actually lower prices. Might have a few blips, but it certainly wouldn't go up. But as they are painfully aware in California, in fact, wholesale prices have been gyrating at very high levels for almost a year now. The California situation, in my view, and there are many others, and by the way, every fact, every conclusion about California seems to be in political dispute within California as to why things happen, what happened, and indeed it's hard to even get data when you're outside the state because what you find is it's misstated in periodical after periodical about nearly every thing going on. So this is a caveat for our capacity to know here. But it seems to me there are three big components that came together in the California crisis. One was that the balance of supply and demand within the state, the capacity to produce and the desire to use, was getting tighter and tighter over the last 3 to 5 years. That's been the case across much of the country. And indeed, I think one of the things that many people underestimated was as that began to tighten up, the margin of error in the system had been reduced significantly. And because of the nature of electricity, because of this transition and deregulation, that proved to be catastrophic. And some will argue it was because there were insufficient plants. Some will argue because the various programs to cut demand had been cut back on, and so demand was rising more rapidly than the earlier predictions. But whatever your take on that is, I think most people agree that capacity and the demand were getting tighter and tighter, not only in California, but throughout the Western market. This meant everything was vulnerable to shifts in the weather, vulnerable to equipment failures, vulnerable to price manipulation by various players, vulnerable even to some tightening down of some of the NOx standards in the process, so that things that might not have mattered in another year in another event suddenly mattered enormously here. Second big component was that natural gas prices went up higher than anybody had been predicting and stayed up longer than anyone had predicted. And this was more the case in California than elsewhere in the country. First, its impact is because California generates more of its electricity than most of us do across the country from natural gas. About a third of their power is generated from natural gas. But the market was much more complicated in California because it wasn't just that at where the gas is produced, the price was rising. It was because the transportation system is tight, congested. There are even been charges of major manipulation by a pipeline out there, so that the prices of natural gas went much higher in the market of California than most other places. A third component were the market rules, which I won't attempt to go through, and they're in great argument about the market rules, those rules that were set up either by the legislature or by the utility commission to form this market. Some of them were actually by other institutions involved. Those rules simply became an intense problem as this supply and demand narrowed its gap. And the result has been, among many things you've read about, one piece of that is a significant financial crisis that frankly makes the electricity market in California look a lot like Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union. And by that I mean was something that many of us forget, and I must admit when I was in Congress we sort of took it so for granted on many occasions, the just general assumption that our markets and our capitalistic system will roughly function. Most contracts will be met, most bills will be paid, and you can honorably count on that to happen. And as debts grew and creditworthiness crashed for the utilities and then other businesses came into play, suddenly we find a marketplace that is an enormous dysfunction in California, at least from those of us from the outside. Compounding the whole thing is, who can decide to take action in order to correct that? And we have very enormously fragmented political authority in the United States to begin with. And we perhaps later will get into the dispute over what role the federal government has in this, what role the state government has in it. But even within the state, like in every state, they struggle between the authority of the state legislature, the governor, the commission, and others in order to get decisions to begin to resolve at least those actions that the government can take. Well, I will be returning, even though I'm moderator. I was originally on just to be a panelist, and so I can't resist. I will have some strong opinions. I will try to be moderate, and I will try to be fair to my colleagues, but I also will score a few points if I can. But let me turn to our very competent folks that we have here tonight. I'll quickly introduce all of them and then come back one by one. On my left, immediate left, is Senator Deborah Bowen. She is a very skilled legislator from California. She is the chairman of the Committee on Energy, Utilities, and Communications, meaning she's right at the center of the legislative actions on this, and her advice is being sought, as it should be, by the governor and others. And her committee is not only legislating, but it also, as I understand, has a very serious investigation underway about allegations of price manipulation. Next to her is Michael Shames. Michael, 20 years ago, established something called the Utility Consumers Action Network. It's a very active grassroots organization, 41,000 members in San Diego, who acts on behalf of residential and small users of electricity. Their influence goes well beyond San Diego, however, and he is a participant in the statewide debate on this issue. He's also an adjunct professor at the University of San Diego Business School. Next to him is Rick Circle. Rick is from New England here. He is the president and CEO of the National Grid USA company, which older folks in the room will remember as New England Electric System. It serves about 1.7 million customers here in New England, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and he's been in the business for over 25 years, and he's here tonight to help be sure that what happened in California doesn't happen here to our lights this evening. Next to Rick is, as Ira Jackson already pointed out, Dr. William Hogan, not only a leading energy economist who has been involved in policy matters when I was in Congress. He used to testify periodically before us on a variety of things on oil, but then he particularly specialized in electricity, and I think he probably is the singular most important intellectual voice in the electricity debates these days. There might be a few people at MIT and other places that want to take us on, but we'll put Bill up as number one. Not only is it because of his own personal engagement and discussion of the issue and analysis, but also because he established something called the Harvard Electricity Policy Group, which seeks to bring together people, all kinds of stakeholders and participants in these issues for the last several years who have regular discussions of these issues. And if there's anything that is clear from those of us that are involved in this, this is an ever-learning process of how to make a market in electricity, and so these discussions have played a critical role. Well, with that, let me quickly finally get to Senator Bowen to give us a hot off the presses, she's literally off the airplane, indication of what's going on in California.
Thank you. And I have a PowerPoint presentation, so the screen should come up. Actually, I should be able to see it here, I'm told.
You can, I think.
Not yet. In any event, it's a pleasure to be here leading off. I've been doing a lot of batting cleanup of late, as you might imagine, in California. I think the first question for us to think about just for a minute is whether or not this is a California problem only, and I'd like the next slide. Let's take a look. This was in the Los Angeles Times a couple of months ago, and I clipped it. It's the dominoes of the power grid around the country. Clearly, the energy problem, the physical energy problem, is a regional issue in the West. The Western grid is interconnected. We buy and sell electricity from British Columbia to San Diego on a daily basis. The related financial problems, most of which now involve, as well as an endless set of dominoes, an endless set of question marks, are, I think, beyond regional. They are national and international in scope. I think, for example, of the investment decisions that Japanese and European investors have made in California and in other parts of the West, and wonder how long those investors will continue to invest in a place where the wholesale power market is completely out of control. Let me walk through just a little bit of what is actually happening in California and blow up at least one myth. Next slide, please. We hear a lot about about enormous demand increases driving this. And it is true that California's demand went up 4% between 1999 and 2000. It's more commonly 2%. Of the growth in the surrounding states, California accounts for 15%, the surrounding states 2,000%. On the right, you see the increase in the total cost in the wholesale electricity market. And there isn't a chart big enough to show what that increase would look like if we put 2001 on it. Next slide. This is the increase in the profits of the 5 major generating companies in California. Now, Reliant did write me a letter saying that this was calculated wrong and that their profits did not increase by 1,685% on their generation. So I haven't had a chance to recalculate it, but I've been telling my constituents it's probably down around 1,100%, and they don't feel a whole lot better about that for some reason. Next slide. Well, I've never seen that slide before. This is what happens when people do your work for you. The California ISO, okay, you can read it, I can't. The annual cost of electricity, okay, nearly $70 billion. We have an estimate that we'll be spending about $70 billion for electricity this year. It was about $7 billion in 1999. Next slide. There should have been a graphic of that. There it is. That's the graphic presentation. These bars show the total wholesale cost of electricity, 1998, 99, 2000, and what we're on track to spend in the state in 2001. Next slide, please. And the final slide shows, I think, or maybe the text was a substitute for it, but it shows the cost, relative cost per kilowatt hour of electricity, which has rocketed from about 3 cents a kilowatt hour to, in January alone of this year, which is usually the low cost rate month of the year, $2 or 27 cents a kilowatt hour, and is now 65 cents a kilowatt hour for forward contracts in August of this summer, to the extent it's available at all. So here's where we are. Imports are down, costs are rising astronomically, and major increases in capacity will not be online soon enough to serve the expected load. So let's look at what California has done and what our options are. On the siting front, since 1999, we've sited 6,000 megawatts of power plants that are now under construction, enough to serve about 6 million homes. Some starting this summer, the balance comes online in 2002 and 2003. I believe that Proposition 9, which was a citizen initiative on the ballot in 1998, delayed some of the investment decisions, but the Constitution gives California citizens a right to access the ballot by initiative. As a historical footnote, that right derives from the progressive movement of 1911 and was a response to the unfettered power in the California legislature of the time, enjoyed by an earlier public utility called the railroads. So the construction underway means that by 2003 or 2004 at the later, we expect that supply will exceed demand even if growth far in excess of the historical rate continues. An action that we've already taken. The state is now the largest buyer of power in the state. We did this to take the solvency problem out of the procurement puzzle. It takes it out at least until the state goes bankrupt too. By becoming the largest buyer, we learned that some of the utilities' dilemma was financial. They were not creditworthy and could not purchase power, and some was a supply or procurement problem. The state entered into long-term contracts in order to secure reliable supply and reduce the risk that needed power would be sold to marketers and traders who would sell it back to California at much higher prices. This exercise produced a very unpleasant truth. California was unable to procure much of the power that will be generated in California this summer, and which was largely sold in California last summer. We have under contract about 800 megawatts, and that means we will be some 3,000 to 5,000 megawatts short. Those rights are held by people who are currently unwilling to sell it to the state at any price. And the only assumption I can draw from this is that several people are planning to retire after they sell power to California this summer. So where does that leave us for choices for this summer? Well, first, conservation. The state began a program last August using general fund and utility money. We will spend more than $1 billion from the general fund this year. We began last summer. We should have ramped up faster. Conservation still won't solve the problem. price signals, time of use metering and real-time metering. We have some time of use metering customers already, more on the way. We are late with price signals, and our consumers have undoubtedly paid for that delay because of the keeping rates flat. The difficulty, however, has been to raise rates at a time when the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has formally found that wholesale rates are not just and reasonable. It's difficult for California officials to explain to their citizens and businesses that costs are far in excess of what the law allows, but they have to pay anyway. Another choice is alternative energy sources, solar, microturbines, wind, and so forth, largely sold out for installation this summer. We may have some help from that next summer. Demand-side markets, we tried this last year, having power bid into the market, reduced power. Very unsuccessful, very little participation last summer. I will expect there will be more this summer. Blackout priorities, various forms of rewiring circuits could give reliability to business customers and more rate stability to residential customers. Right now, there are a lot of bills pending in the legislature to protect various types of users from blackouts. Interest groups are fighting over the last Oreo in the bag rather than working to secure more Oreos or find other kinds of desserts. But for right now, the circuits are wired in such a way that that's not a practical solution for this summer, nor are various other technological solutions. Fifth option for this summer, commandeer the output of those plants that will generate in California this summer and which have not been willing to sell to us. We do have the authority to do this. I can't even begin to discuss the merits in the short period of time we have, but I suspect we'll return to this question. And finally, the question of Ferc intervention. The Western electricity markets are regional in nature. The biggest challenge for California is it's darn hard to fashion a state market or state solutions to regional problems, and in fact, that is not our job. It is the job of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. In the current wild market, suppliers have an incentive to produce less than they can in order to drive up the price, but there's a difference between profits and profiteering. Even in Texas, it's an unfair trade practice subject to treble damages to withhold essential supplies in an emergency. Here in Boston, I know you wouldn't tolerate a shovel merchant selling shovels for $400 after a blizzard, nor should we tolerate this systematic destruction of California and the Western U.S. economy. Next slide, please. And now one final question. Couldn't you have foreseen and prevented this? And in closing, I will turn to Mark Twain. A man who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. We are still writing the history of this crisis, and right now we are getting a new cat every day.
All right, also from California, Michael Shames.
All right, we'll keep at it. Hello all, and I am both flattered and extremely worried that all of you are here today in this room to hear about what's going on in California while you have a California day outside where you could be spending and enjoying the day. What I'd like to do is touch very briefly on three major points. You've got a wonderful primer from Senator Bowen as to what's been going on in California. The 3 points I'll leave you with before we go into our conversation is, first, the politics of energy must be considered. The second issue is that there's a role of the regulator even in a deregulated market. And finally, we're going to talk a little about something called the conscience of the market. So in 5 minutes, we'll try to cover each of those points. I should tell you, from a policy perspective, you are witnessing history. This is a wonderful time to be a policy student. It really is. I mean, Harvard has always specialized in case studies. What you have before you is a disaster study, and one that is going to have implications not just in California, but in other states and other countries. And I should tell you that just personally speaking, I get calls probably once a day from the media from other countries, international media, just to find out what's going on in California. It also will probably keep Jay Leno and David Letterman in jokes, at least for the next couple of months. Let's talk real briefly about these points I wanted to raise. The politics of energy. Folks, electricity is not shoes. It is not even bread, which is a very important commodity. Electricity is something that many people, at least in California, view as an entitlement, as a right, as something that they expect. And so the political response by the public to this public policy initiative is an important factor that I'm not sure that either the politicians in California or the regulators in California, and nor even the regulators in other states have fully appreciated. There's a point to which the public, if they are disappointed, if they feel as though they have not gotten what they had bargained for, may respond in such a fashion as to undermine any policy initiative, no matter how well designed. So please keep that in mind. I call that the mom test, in that if you ever want to initiate a public policy, you want to pass it by your mom and see if she would go with it, because if she wouldn't, you may want to rethink it. We haven't done that in California, and I think what you're going to see is the public weighing in through an initiative process, through the election process, in such a way as to perhaps distort what an economist might view as a perfectly elegant solution. Let's talk about the second issue, the role of the regulator. One of the hugest mistakes made in California, and I fear in other states as well, is this belief, misguided, that we're going to deregulate. There's no more need for the regulator. We'll just stand aside and let the markets do their magic. If California offers any wisdom for all of you, it is that, in fact, the process of deregulating such a commodity such as electricity probably requires greater involvement, greater monitoring functions by the regulator, and a certain, in fact, perhaps an enhanced need for accountability from those regulators. The California regulators were put on notice a good 2 years ago that this debacle was coming. There were a number of studies that suggested to them that the market that they had hoped that was going to develop was not developing. They didn't take action, and what's worse is in many cases, they didn't have the wherewithal, they didn't have the information, the data necessary to confirm these concerns. They were as much in the dark as I fear California will be this summer. And I can assure you, there's almost 100% certainty that California will suffer significant, numerous blackouts during the summer, and probably next summer as well. Now, let's talk about my third topic, the conscience of the market. There is none. And you're seeing it at its ruthless best in California, both this past year as well as this summer, and probably next summer. The companies that are making money in California are making it hand over fist, and I think Senator Bowen has touched upon that very nicely. The question that a business, I think, has to ask itself is, at what point is enough money enough? Or is it even their job to think about that? And again, when we go back to point number one, and that is the politics of electricity, it's a factor that needs to be considered. Because you're going to see a backlash. You're already seeing resentment in California that's being measured by the polls that suggest that Californians, most Californians, do not believe that this is really a crisis, that the shortages have been manufactured as a pretext for these companies to make excessive amounts of money. Now, it doesn't matter whether that's true. The perception matters. And I should tell you, beyond perception, there's a good likelihood that's true. And it's going to have an implication in how the policy develops in California. The final question that we've been asked of, and I'm going to be within my 5 minutes, shockingly, is, will it happen here? Will it happen in Boston? Will it happen in New York? Will it happen in Philadelphia? Certainly, from a California perspective, we hope so, only because misery loves company. But I think more likely, the answer is yes. It may not happen in the form of blackouts, but I think already in Pennsylvania, which is being held up as the model of deregulation, you're seeing quite a bit of stress there. You're seeing a retail market not develop. In New York City, you're likely to see, if not blackouts, certainly increases in prices this summer, perhaps more next. And Mother Nature will probably be the deciding arbiter in that outcome. In Massachusetts, the gentleman here to my left, Rick, will probably tell you there's no chance of that happening. But it will happen, maybe not this year, maybe not next year, unless the lessons of California are heeded. And thus, I look forward to our discussion on those lessons.
Good. Excuse me, Rick, before we turn to a New England perspective, I forgot at the outset, I wanted to introduce a New England congressman from Massachusetts, Ed Markey. Ed has been very involved in electricity issues for many years, and in 1992, as a leading member of my subcommittee, he was the advocate of some of the key ideas that became part of the 1992 Energy Act. So while he's in the audience tonight, tomorrow night you can hear him here on the subject of technology tomorrow evening. But with that, let's turn to Rick Circle.
Thank you all. And you might have guessed from the title National Grid USA and the fact that the roots of the company are here in New England. In fact, they go back to before 1900, that USA in the title says they must be doing something more, and we are. Our parent company is headquartered in London, and we operate the transmission system in England and Wales, in Zambia, all of Argentina. And the reason I wanted to start with that perspective is they all have established competitive markets for electricity. They all have regulated wires companies, but in its entirety, the generation is competitive. And in fact, it's working very well there. So there isn't something that's fundamentally limited about those systems. It can work, and it has worked in other places. Mentioning David Letterman, I don't have time for a top 10 list, but I'll try 5 of why New England is different from California. The purpose of which isn't to suggest that it absolutely couldn't happen here, because that would be arrogance, but rather to suggest what are the lessons that we have to learn, what do we have to pay attention to, what is important in making sure that it doesn't. And so beginning first with supply and demand, there's a fundamental imbalance in California, and that's a very real factor. In New England, we have been building new capacity. We built 1,500 megawatts since 1999 alone, and another 2,000 megawatts before the end of this year. If you were to try to put that by comparison into California with a 3 times factor, that would be the equivalent of 12,000 megawatts in the California system when you take into account how much larger they are. That balance does allow us to have a lot more confidence in how all of the markets work and all of the interconnections and all of the issues that have been previously mentioned. The second issue is reliance on imports. In California, they rely substantially on the transfer of power from the Northwest, from hydro into California, and to some extent from the balance of the West. For whatever reason, I'm not sure whether it was parochialism, New Englanders, and in fact the entire Northeast, has been a lot more conscious of being energy independent, and so we rely to a much less significant extent on one another. Transferring that power only for emergencies, but not for a general reliance and not for economy. And that is a fundamental difference. I think it does say something just in a general business sense about how many of the factors of production do you need to have in your control when you're making decisions. The third is the reliance on long-term contracts. In New England, and particularly our company, we have about 80% of the power that we deliver to our customers under contract, in which the terms of the price, the delivery, fuel accepted are generally known. For the port that is short-term, that is the other 20%, even that is at this point hedged over 6, 12, 18 months. So we have it under contract, and that's a fundamental difference between New England, New York as well, and California, where too much of the market was left to be on the spot prices, and so they were more subject to changes in things like gas prices, which Phil Sharp mentioned in his opening remarks. It's the equivalent of driving a car with a spear in the center of the steering wheel so that you're really, really careful in case there's a bump. The fourth is market structure. New England has had a power pool in place for 30 years. While that is not the same as developing an ISO and having market structures, it's not even close, it did create the kind of relationship between the companies and relationship between regulators and relationship between the federal government that allowed for the process of building that infrastructure and those market structures that were necessary. We were able to do that more efficiently. I will also say in candor, we learned from California. We were behind in the sense of when we started and ended up ahead with respect to the ultimate outcome. I'll point out with some irony that the pool structure here in New England was created as a result of the 1965 blackout and of the entire Northeast, a lesson which then resulted in the utilities being forced to organize. So there are some lessons and one can learn from them. I think the fifth point I wanted to make was with respect to price. And New England regulators and legislators have allowed market-driven costs to be reflected in customers' bills. That's simple enough to understand. When wholesale prices, retail rates must follow. And we understand that with respect to natural gas, with home heating oil. We understand it with respect to gasoline for the SUVs that we all want to drive. We have to understand, at least in this market, that it applies to electricity. That's not easy to do. It takes a great deal of political courage. It's not easy for customers to pay it, and we're working hard on what we can do to help them deal with it. But I think that there is a fundamental issue here. I'd illustrate it by saying I was in D.C. I'm in the taxi taking one of those short rides that you're all familiar with, where you go from zone to zone. I could always want to call Ed and say, Ed, how much should I be paying for this one, right? Are they quoting me the right price? There's now a little sign in the taxi that says they're adding $1 because the cost of gasoline is higher. And I think if any of us believe that the regulatory commission that did that got together and said, well, we've got to do it to protect taxi owners, we're all fooling ourselves. They didn't do that, but they knew that if they didn't, all those taxis would be sitting out at the airport, not driving around doing those short hauls. They'd all be waiting for a real long time with the engine off so that they could get one quick fare where they made a lot more money and burned a lot less fuel. They wanted the market to operate efficiently, and if a market's going to operate efficiently, you have to let those prices go through. One last comment, and it goes to the kinds of things that utility companies do to in fact make the market work, and we've been doing them historically. That is, we do rely on calling our customers and saying, you know, it's in the third day of being hot. It's sweltering. We need you now to reduce your consumption, and you're on a rate in which we pay you to be interrupted. We're now calling upon you. And we, in fact, go to public appeals, and we've done that on average once a year for the last 10 years. And we've actually reduced voltage a couple of times here in New England in the last 10 years, hopefully without notice to any of you all. We have not done the rolling of blackouts here. They have done it in GPU. The reason I lay that out for you is that we may have, when we have severe weather conditions, we may have situations in which we have to rely upon those as we have in the past, but that's not the same thing as the kind of crisis that I think we're experiencing today in California. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. Now we'll turn to Bill Hogan. Give him a shot.
Well, briefly, I just would like to address 3 points that have to do partly with what you've already heard in these excellent introductions. One is the point that Rick talked about, is there anything fundamental here about this problem? The second is what actually happened in California. And the third is to say a little bit about what might be done prospectively in dealing with the problems in California, which are extremely severe. On the first point as to whether or not there's anything fundamental about this, I think the answer is, as Rick said, no. I believe that evidence, when you look at it, will demonstrate that it's entirely possible to design and operate markets in the competitive sectors of electricity, the generation and some of the retail functions. And there are many examples, particularly in wholesale markets, which we've done better around the world, less so in the retail side, but that's a problem which also can be addressed. But there are many examples in other parts of the world and other parts of the United States where these markets so far have worked not only in theory, but they've also worked in practice. And the list is long. Rick mentioned England and Wales. To that I would add Norway, Sweden, Denmark, the new markets that are developing in Germany and Spain, Argentina, Chile, Peru, New Zealand, Australia, the PJM system in the mid-Atlantic states in the United States, New York, and even New England, which have so far been able to function in this environment. Not perfectly. These markets don't work perfectly. No markets do. But the problems that they have are reasonably well understood and are manageable or fixable. And the difficulties they've encountered are 2 orders of magnitude less than those that have been encountered in California and in the West. So I think the California problem is fundamentally a man-made problem. That doesn't mean it's not serious. It's a very serious problem. And it's not easy to fix because of all the things that have actually happened, but I don't think it's inherent in the nature of the operation of these markets. Now, what actually happened in California? Well, you've heard some description about the perfect storm, which was all of these difficulties, the increased demand, the lower hydro, the increased gas prices, environmental constraints which became more binding, the pipeline problems, the possibility of manipulation of the markets, all of those things that were really unfortunate bad luck. And if we had all of those things go wrong simultaneously this summer in New York or New England, I'm not sure we'd do especially well, so we don't want to be too cavalier about this. But these problems did confront California. They didn't all happen instantaneously overnight, although it is a fact that in the spring of last year in California, you could have bought a contract for power through the summer and the fall for under $80 or under 8 cents a kilowatt hour, $80 a megawatt hour. And that's what the market thought was going to happen in the summer. In the event, it turned out that the prices were 5 or 6 times higher than that and growing. So even the market didn't anticipate everything that was going to happen. But nonetheless, the problems and the bad luck that developed in the context of a system which was designed by people and designed badly by people in that process. And I'm not going to go through all of the details. As Phil said, there's a lot to do with market design. But I would identify the turning point of what happened in California as in September of 1995. By the standards of these things, a long time ago. And what happened a long time ago in California in September of 1995 was the agreement that was reached, frankly, in a backroom negotiation by some of the leading parties in the California process. It was called the Memorandum of Understanding. And this agreement enshrined the details of the flawed market design which developed in California that evolved into the legislation that passed and so forth. And something else happened fundamentally at that time. Up until that day, the regulators in California, I would say, were actually doing a pretty good job. And they were trying to figure out what to do. They came out with something called the Blue Book, and they had a design which was not elegantly perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but by comparison to what was finally implemented was much better and probably would have worked reasonably well. But that was driven aside by a problem that was unusual, if not unique, to California. Michael talked about the politics of energy and how important the politics of energy are. And they are important. I agree completely with what he said. But the problem after September of 1995 is that in California, the only thing that mattered was the politics of energy. And what we had was a negotiation process amongst those interested parties that viewed the problem as dividing up a pie. They were just going to decide who was going to get which piece in this pie, and everybody got a little bit. They got their favorite component. But nobody in that process after that time viewed this as anything like designing a bridge. The problem of making sure that the bridge is actually going to stand later on, and that the pieces fit together, and that the stresses can be withstood when those stresses come later on. And that was a fundamental and dramatic change, and a very unfortunate one. And what resulted was something where we had a design which, when you looked at it at the time, many people said, this isn't going to work. And when it was put in place starting in January of 1998, it started not to work rapidly. And most people don't realize this, but well before the meltdown of last summer, by the end of 1999, the federal regulators had thrown up their hands and said that the design that had been produced in California was fundamentally flawed, and they had to go back to the drawing boards and start over again. And there was a process underway, and it was a race against time, and they lost. that race, and then we had the summertime and everything that's gone on before that. So there are difficult lessons to be learned from there, but the critical lesson in comparison with places that have done well in these markets is the places that have done well have been much more attentive to thinking about the bridge problem. How do you make sure that this is a well-designed architecture that fits together? It is not only a political problem. It is also not only a technical problem. It's both kinds of problems, and you have to consider both of those things at the same time. So what to do about it going forward? I have no easy answer to this question, but I will tell you the things that I've been saying about it for quite a while. The first and most fundamental thing, and which is a characteristic of successful markets that Phil talked about, is you have to pay your bills. You just can't have a market that operates where people think they're not going to get paid. And to this day, California has not, in the aggregate, as a matter of principle, articulated that principle, that it would in fact see that the bills get paid, and that propagates through the whole system, and that's what caused the transition from an energy problem in December, up before December, into a first order financial crisis afterwards, and all the things that Deborah and Michael have been trying to deal with since then. Secondly, I don't see any way to deal with the short-term problem without raising prices to customers and raising them significantly. You cannot buy power for $200 or $300 or whatever price it is, dollars per megawatt hour, and sell it for $65, and imagine that that's going to stay in place for very long. And there's efforts underway to do that now. The Public Utility Commission has talked about it. The governor talked about it last week. But frankly, my own view is that the numbers that they're talking about are too timid. They're going to have to do more, and it's going to be very unpleasant. But I think it's necessary, designed in the right way, in the way that they're doing that, to put that on the margin in order to give incentives for people to conserve, because that's the only way to reduce the number of rolling blackouts that they have to deal with in the summertime. Second is you've got to fix the market design, and the California ISO, the independent system operator out there, I understand, actually filed their market stabilization plan last week. And if you look closely at that design, it's not perfect, but it does have the essential features that have been successful other places in the world. It's a dramatic reversal of the previous design philosophy and detail that existed. It's now in front of the federal regulators. They should embrace it quickly, fix the parts that need to be fixed, and put it in place as fast as they can, and that'll help. And then finally come to the question about market manipulation and the incredible prices that we see in California. Part of those incredible prices are caused by the natural gas problems that you heard about, and by the shortage of the water, and by the unavailability of nitrous oxide emissions, particularly last year. And those problems are going to continue. And then part of it is caused by some degree of market manipulation, people withholding power. We don't know exactly what the mix is of those things, but the solution for the first three problems is raise the prices, get the market design working, and try to weather through this storm as best you can. To deal with the market power problem, the proposals that have come out of the federal energy regulators and the California ISO, and I think the California group has actually got the story better, understands it better in this regard, and that is to put in a system of bid caps, as they're called, which constrain the prices that can be bid by generators across the entire Western system. And only the federal regulators would have the power to do that. And if they're convinced that there is market manipulation, there is no good solution to that problem, but the bid cap solution is the least bad of many other bad ideas. You should understand that there's a technical difference between bid caps and just keeping the price low. What bid caps do is they prevent people from withholding supply, but they don't prevent prices from being high if there's a real shortage. And if there is a real shortage out there, and frankly I think there is, this solution will solve the market power problem, but it won't solve the problem that prices are going to be very high. The California situation is a man-made problem. Eventually we're going to be able to get out of it, but too much time has passed. I don't see any way to get out of this problem easily or painlessly, and I think the difficulties that Senator Bowen and Michael Shames face and their colleagues face out there are just horrendous. It is very bad for California. It is very bad for the West. It is very bad for the United States. And anything that we can do to try to help, but one of the things that we need to do to try to help is to be honest about just exactly what has to be done. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. In a moment, we'll turn to questions from the audience at the two microphones, but in watching Michael and Senator Bowen, I suspected they would like to have a comment or two on some of the things that the rest of us said before we turn there, or we can have a little interaction, but we do want to spend as much time as we can responding to folks. So,
We've been through it.
I think I was invited here to inject a dose of reality. So I'd like to suggest to all of you, get real. When there's discussions about let's let the price, the true price of energy flow through to these customers, you should be honest about the price and allow these price increases. My two quick responses to that, and I hear it many times, is one, if you do that, you will have a rebellion in California that will make the Boston Tea Party look like a high tea. The public would not accept a tripling, a quadrupling of their rates. And folks, it happened in San Diego. I witnessed ground zero this past summer when the sleepy Navy town of San Diego, where everybody's polite, it's Lotus Land, got hit by a tripling of bills. And the public, about 90% of the public were ready to rebel. The last 10% were just trying to figure out what hit them first. They were stunned. It isn't going to work. Secondly, there is no confidence by anyone in California that the prices that are being charged are in fact fair or just. And the federal regulators have confirmed that. They are not fair and just. And as Professor Hogan indicated, nobody really knows how much those overcharges are. It's very hard to quantify the extent to which the market has been manipulated. So when there's no faith by the market, by the customer, that the prices are accurate, they won't even respond to the price signals you give them. They will believe they are aberrant, and they'll respond in a fashion that is not economically efficient. So I, again, urge all of you, get real, because this is real life, and the academic approaches don't necessarily apply.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's useful. Again, I come back to this question of how do you explain to a business in California that their electricity bill is going to go up 1,000%, even though the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has found that wholesale rates are not just and reasonable, which is the mandate of the Federal Power Act. And I actually think that much of this comes down to the way in which the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has chosen to go about granting the authority to charge market rates to generators. They do not ask whether there are geographical restrictions that preclude power from other places from being used to substitute. They solely do a numeric exercise that says what percentage of the whole California market does this particular generator have. They don't look at overall supply questions. They don't look at market structure. They use a paradigm that probably was fine in a regulated environment, and they have transferred it to a market environment with a commodity that is essential and cannot be stored except in water behind a dam, which is dependent so wholly on God. So we need to revisit the whole way that the Ferc grants market rate authority, because that's where this non-enforcement comes from. And if you believe that the market will all solve all problems by itself, it will. But if a third of your patients in a surgery are dead before the fix works, it really isn't a successful market, in my view. And if that is the result of a deregulated market and federal control, then we will not have deregulated markets for anything. We're very close in California to saying we were better. Public power polls 90% in San Diego, which is a Republican stronghold. People would rather pay a little too much and a little for an inefficient public power authority than risk being gouged in order to get a 10 or 15% price savings some of the time. And you've got to have some mechanism, not of saying tigers are bad, but of saying we're not going to let tigers roam the streets of Sacramento.
I guess I can't resist commenting, having been in sort of both shoes in dealing with price rises in natural gas back in the 70s and oil rises and whatnot. And in a sense, I'm struck by both realities that are clashing here, because I think Bill Hogan's reality is in part right, and I think their reality about people is part right. But I think there's an intense lesson that won't help right now in California But had there been a willingness to address some of these issues 6 months ago, we would probably not be talking about anything like the price rises that we are now. I think the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission was slow, but I think the state of California, the government, and the commission were very slow. But when they adamantly said no raise in rates, although they quickly had to do it 10% anyway, emergency rate, they sent signals that we ain't going to budge, and I think misinformed the public as well. Because part of the trouble here is, naturally the public is rebelling. They can't get a straight answer from industry. I don't think they're getting straight answers from government, and I think that therefore it's easy to believe anything. I have having sat in similar shoes, never with the crisis that you're facing. One of the practical realities for a policymaker, though, is, of course, I don't know how you know what to believe, because the trouble is you are confronted with everybody and very smart people coming in, and they're spending millions of bucks to do it as well, to say, here is the reality, and how to make a decision. But I also think there's another underlying thing about energy prices in this country is, while we ought to be very compassionate about the poor and those that are without, I think we have to wake up to something as a middle class in this country, and that is to understand that we want to have it both ways. We have had energy prices down. Our disposable incomes have dramatically risen since the 1980, and our energy prices, by and large, until this last blip, and it's more than a blip, have been going down. And the truth is, we've just been having our cake and eating it too, and it's partly catching up with us in this process. Well, that ends my lecture, and why don't we open it up? Why don't we open it up to questions? We'll start over here, and if you'll try to just quickly identify your status here at the university or outside the university, and then try to ask a quick question. You may direct it if you wish at somebody in the panel, otherwise we'll round up somebody to answer it. Thank you.
Okay, my name is Josh Cable, and I'm a freshman at the college and a resident of Orange County, California. And I have to say I'm very concerned, but I think you've all addressed the issue very well. But my question is, and I think it's many Californians, is what is the future for California Power and the investigation of the power producers in California?
Well, the problem with the investigatory route, and Ferc's jurisdiction is limited. If they don't start an investigation within 60 days, they don't have jurisdiction. So then we're reliant on court, on legal proceedings, which I think could look much like the tobacco litigation, rooms full of documents and years of theories and testing, and that does absolutely nothing to get us through the next year or two. I do believe now that PG&E has filed for bankruptcy that it is appropriate for policymakers to stop the course that we're on for dealing with the long-term fix. I think we ought to stop talking about acquiring the transmission grid, at least for right now, and have a discussion about what our values are and whether we want competition in power. We ought to talk about the municipal utilities, which are a third of our supply and which largely are not experiencing price spikes, and determine what, as a people, we want. And the problem, of course, is there is no one what that we want. That's essentially going to be a political process. In the short term, get under your desk and duck. It's going to be a really bad summer.
If I could just add here, one of the lessons I think out of this that I try to allude to is, while there's an argument over how much demand increased in the absence of supply, I think everybody agrees it got tight. And the reality here is, if you want to protect consumers, try your damnedest around the country never to let a market get that tight. Right. Because it's very hard after the fact. You can go around and make all the speeches you want, you can have all the investigations you want, but you'll never recoup them dollars, and you'll never get at the base thing. We learned this in the 1970s. So take seriously these public debates over whether or not we need new facilities, whether or not we need demand-side reduction actions. They are of profound consequences. Once it gets to this point, you can try your heart out, and some people you can get back some money, but you'll never get a correction in a market like that. Right. Yeah, yes.
Hello, my name's John Simon. I'm an MPP graduate from 1996. My question is, how does a power generator go about manipulating the market? And as the Senator pointed out, power is the most perishable commodity there is. And if you refuse to sell it, you lose it. So if you're a power generator and you decide to withhold power as a way of driving up the price so that you can sell some other power at a later date at a higher price, you're taking a pretty big gamble, and your hope is that when you eventually bring your power to market, somehow that in itself won't drive down the price back to where it would have been before, and you somehow have to recoup the losses you took while you're holding your power back.
Who wants to go after that?
Yeah,
Well, I think conceptually it's slightly different than the way you described it, but the problems are quite real. But basically, if you own enough generating plants, you don't have to withdraw all of them, just withdraw one of them. And then that reduces the supply and drives up the market price. And then you make more money on the generator plants that are still running than you lose on the one that you took out. That's the basic economic calculation. And I think that if you look at the way the ownership of the generation is configured in California, and you look at some of these problems about constraints in the transmission grid and shortages in capacity in the system as a whole, and you assume that the generators haven't already sold the power forward in long-term contracts, in other words, they're making everything currently in the current spot market, then you can find lots of cases where you have arithmetic that would show they have an incentive to do this. Now, those are several assumptions along the way. Whether or not they did it, how much of it have they actually sold forward, these are the things that it's hard to find out. But I think there are, you can easily construct examples where they have incentives to do that.
It's fair to say also that in a market where there is scarcity, and we are tight, things can happen. Perversions occur that wouldn't otherwise occur in a market where there's greater supply. Is that a fair statement? Yeah.
The final piece of this is that we had real-time information about pricing that was available on the internet. And so other bidders could see where there was a geographic shortfall that could only be met by certain units within a certain geographic area, and everybody could see whatever everybody else's prices were. So it's a little bit like having a level 2 screen on NASDAQ, where you can tell because of the way the bids and the asks are and the limited number of bidders or particular purchasers. I mean, there are only 3 investor-owned utilities. You could get a pretty good handle on what was going to be needed, and you can really tell by the weather when things are going to be tight. Weather is the biggest driver in our peaks.
Hi, good evening. My name is Alan Clements. I'm from Boston. And my background is I'm actually on the board of directors of an environmental group, but I'm also involved in business, manufacturing. And I just bring a sort of diverse interest to this issue. I'd really like to thank the Kennedy School for having this debate. I think the one viewpoint that's missing is a generator, and that would have really made things lively, I'm sure. But anyway, I really like Michael Shame's comments about electricity being a right. And I would assert that electricity price is indeed a right in this country. And I think before a generator or a transmission company, a wires company, before they profit, I think the public good has to be taken into account. I sort of have lived in Maine and Massachusetts for the last several years, both states. And when Maine deregulated in 1998 or 1999, or when it started, I guess just last year.
You have a question there?
Yes, I do. The hearings were in 1997. Basically, you know, everything we heard is a kind of "I told you so." It won't work because you've got private or public. They're public companies, but you've got private corporations, basically non-governmental corporations, that are charged by their charters with making a profit, and they're making a profit on a fundamental public right. So increased profits will only come out of ratepayers' pockets. So it's a myth that ratepayers will pay less through competition, as well as the environment suffering. I mean, that's just, you know, we're in emergency status here, whether or not it has happened. And I would just comment that it is not necessarily blackouts. Blackouts, if there's blackouts, you obviously don't make money. No one makes money, everybody loses. But if you're selling every bit of power that's possibly being generated, of course, there's huge profits being made. My question is actually to Rick Sergio, Chairman Sergio. I'm actually a stockholder of National Grid, and my question is, why on earth should I continue investing in your company? Why shouldn't I invest in the generators?
have a shareholder here. I think I have more than one, right? A couple others out there. I think that this entire discussion is about markets and how they work, and I think that in every investment there's an element of risk and reward, but with respect to our own circumstance, the likelihood that we can continue to produce solid returns is there matched against the risk of the business we're in. And I think while it might look attractive to buy generators today, you've got a few people on this panel who are dead set in saying, at least from a political sense, that those markets ought to change. And two folks probably over here who say, well, maybe not politically, but the economic forces, if they're left to wile their way through, will take care of it anyway, right? And so I believe that ultimately generation is going to be like any other commodity, and the price will be driven down.
Yeah, but as long as
It's
FERC
soon enough for California, I'm not.
We need to go to somebody else. Here, a question, yes.
I'm Michael Charney with the Massachusetts Climate Action Network. I'd like to ask Bill Hogan and perhaps other members of the panel, how well do you think the demand-side management is going? How well could it go, and what kind of a price signal would be needed, and for how long to really tighten up the inefficiencies?
Well, I think the story across the country is that it's not demand side. This part of the problem is not going well at all. The retail market structure in most places in the country hasn't been done very well. There are two parts to this problem. One is how you get the wholesale market design in place and working so you can support competition amongst generators. And then secondly, how you do the retail side. And there's general agreement, I think, of people who have been analyzing this problem, is that we have neglected the retail side in a way that was going to be consistent with the markets, and we haven't gotten enough demand-side participation, either through demand-side management programs, real-time pricing, and we should do more. The reason I think it's important, especially to do it quickly in California, and disagree with Michael about this, is because I think there's going to be a revolution in California this summer no matter what. It's just a question of which revolution we're going to have. Are we going to have the revolution because prices are high, particularly at the margin, protecting the people who are poor, protecting the people who are using a relatively small volume, and let people choose voluntarily to turn their lights off? Or are we going to turn their lights off involuntarily all across the state through these rolling blackouts? We don't have a comfortable choice that avoids those two problems. And so it's a choice of which one do you think is better. And I think, I probably disagree with Michael about this, but I think that the demand side response that we would get would be significant if we let the prices go up at the margin and along the designs that were talked about by the governor and by the Public Utility Commission.
I can just add, obviously, we've lost in the process of restructuring in several states. Some of the existing governmental efforts through the utilities were diminished. I don't think there's any question about that in California and in New York and to some degree in New England. But I think what we've seen is, while we have not seen it at the residential level, we have seen in the industrial commercial market the moving in of a more aggressive and active separate component, not the utility, but a business interest that will come in and manage your big commercial entity, your big industrial entity. And at that level, we are seeing some positive market developments. We're not seeing that, to my knowledge, at the residential level. And I suspect even with we get to real-time pricing and things like this, which we're not likely to get to the residential area, frankly, anytime soon, I think we'll need supplemental efforts to try to get consumers to see the benefit. The average consumer. But right now, I mean, one of the utilities and one of the directives in California is to set up the radio facility to turn off air conditioning temporarily in homes that are where somebody may not be there. And if you participate in that, you get a benefit on your bill, and the utility puts that in. These are not brand new devices. They're used several places in the country. There's lots of that kind of stuff that can be done.
The lesson, I think, in that program, the Air Conditioner Interrupt program, is a SMUD program, Sacramento Municipal Utility. It's a muni. The real lesson with demand side is that dropping demand completely does not work. Almost nobody wants to shut down and go home. Demand reduction, which is harder to achieve, works better. Interestingly, the other difficulty with strategies like prices go really high in an office building, so you close and send everybody home, is you actually wind up using more power. because people go home and turn on their air conditioners, and then while they're home, they watch TV and do the laundry and iron some clothes. So you actually just shift, and that in part is a public education process. Art Rosenfeld, who's one of our energy commissioners, likes to say that part of the problem we have is that electricity's been dirt cheap, and so people have treated it like dirt. And we don't have, people don't understand what it is in their house that uses how much electricity. We're about to go through some rude shocks in that regard.
Yes.
My name is George Mercury. I live in Central Square, and I use about an average of 100 kilowatt hours monthly. And I am so disappointed with the Massachusetts restructuring that I am seriously and aggressively investigating how to take that 100 kilowatt hours per month offline, off-grid. I'm interested in SMUD. SMUD and, I guess, LA Water and Power. When last I heard, which was last fall, we're doing fairly well. From scattered reports, municipals, smaller, much smaller than the three majors, but SMUD is my favorite utility and has been for many years, and I would wonder if their successes can be scaled up and replicated and what their situation actually is today.
Don't deify SMUD. I mean, they've been very good in terms. The Sacramento Municipal Utility District has been very aggressive in promoting demand side and renewable energies, but it has not been as successful as I think it's going to need to be to make it through the summer. SMUD is looking at rate increases. Los Angeles Department of Water and Power also, under David Freeman, has been very aggressive in demand side. They've done very well because they kept their generation. They have enough to go around. I just one comment on conservation. There are few people in California more ardently in support of conservation and demand-side management than Senator Bowen and myself, and we've been preaching that gospel for years. You cannot understate how difficult it is to achieve meaningful conservation, demand-side reduction, especially among small customers. It takes a lot of time. And in San Diego, just a lesson, our rates tripled. Our bills tripled. Rates went up more. Bills tripled. Average customers looking at bills from $70 up to $200, and yet over that summer, the reduction of usage was only about 10%. And even now, businesses who have been subjected to rates that were 4 to 5 times higher than they paid the year before have reduced their consumption by about 20%. That is not a lot of savings when you think about it. There's a significant amount of what we call inelasticity among electric customers. So it takes time to achieve demand-side responsiveness. Is that fair?
I'm sorry, we're really starting to run out of time. We can only take one more question. Sorry about that, and go ahead quickly, and we'll.
Thanks. Alan Nogi with the Union of Concerned Scientists. Rick and Bill, you did a very eloquent job articulating the differences between California and Massachusetts in our restructuring. What about the following 3 similarities? During the 5 years DREG was debated in California, energy efficiency budgets were cut 50%. In Massachusetts, our restructuring law ramped the energy efficiency spending down by 25%, and it expires if it's not renewed next year. California utilities canceled renewable energy contracts in 1995 worth 1,400 megawatts of capacity. Here in New England, renewable energy generation has been reducing as utilities buy out contracts, and the mechanisms built into our restructuring laws that were supposed to accelerate renewables development haven't kicked in yet. To the extent that California market problems have been in part due to market manipulation, do we really have the mechanisms in place in our New England power pool to prevent similar manipulation here? Outages of power plants in California in the last year are up by a factor of 4 to 5. Here in New England, in the year following deregulation, power plant outages went up by 50 to 100%. The power pool's working on a study yet, but hasn't identified the causes. And finally, kind of getting to Phil's question, even though we do have substantial new natural gas power plant capacity under construction here in New England, why do we believe that a market will indefinitely support a surplus of generating capacity? In any market, aren't we going to get to an equilibrium, and aren't we eventually going to have shortages and price volatility?
A whole host of questions. I'm not sure we can deal with all of them.
1 minute, Bill. Go for it.
Well, I'll try to quickly do the first two. I think with respect to the demand-side management programs, while as a percentage they were cut here in Massachusetts, they were also at what we thought was at a very positive level. They were cut to levelize them across the state, and unfortunately, I think we ended up with the least common denominator. So they certainly were lower for our company than what we had historically been spending, and probably we would want to continue to have spent that if we could. But I don't think it was sustainable statewide. I think it should be re-upped. I think it's essential that it is, and I think certainly some aspects of what we're doing, particularly the public appeal side of it, that is, to what extent do we educate the public through advertising, probably needs to increase, because there is no other natural place for it. If you think about it, it's either the government or the delivery company that's going to be advertising to use less. It's not going to come from the generators. They're not going to naturally do it. And with respect to renewables, I think we've done a good job, I think, from the public policy side, but the implementation of that has left something to be desired. We've got some work to do going forward.
As to the question about will the market sustain enough capacity so that prices are relatively moderated on average, even though occasionally you'll have peak hours and so on. The experience outside of California in particular and elsewhere in the world, if you look at England and Wales, Norway and places like that, has been yes. And that's partly because what you have is a technological change phenomenon going on. You have people investing in new power plants that are more efficient and better than the old ones, and they are slowly replacing them, but they're still around, and so that when the prices actually go up, they serve as a damper on that process. So the experience actually in many places in the world has been explaining why prices were so low rather than explaining why prices would turn out to be high. But there's no guarantee of this, and certainly one of the lessons that's coming out of the California discussion is that the sort of perfect market theory about how the signals will go, people will anticipate them, they'll build in advance, they'll sign long-term contracts and all this thing, has not been given a fair test, but we certainly don't like the result of what we're seeing in the California situation, and there's a lot more interest in having some sort of proxy for this through, and in PJM, in the mid-Atlantic states in New York and New England, we do have installed capacity markets where people are supposed to, by regulation, are required to obtain capacity that exceeds the peak demand in order to make sure that just the kind of problems that we're talking about don't develop. California did not have that feature. They're now talking about instituting such a feature.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, we would like to clarify for you more of the issues, and I have no doubt it's now clear in your mind what California ought to do and how the rest of us in the country can avoid the problems. It's obviously an extremely serious situation there, and it's a major challenge intellectually, a major challenge politically and economically to make decisions here. And if anyone thinks that there's no longer any need for policymakers, which is a concern here at the Kennedy School, I can assure you there is a desperate need at the moment. Thank you very much.